Welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Now, a recent poll claims that over 80% of Gen Z young people are not proud to live in America, and over half of millennials feel the same way. If a large swath of the population actually hates the country, it's not hard to understand why or how they've engaged in wholesale attacks on the institutions of a society that they detest. Statues of Washington and Jefferson are torn down and removed from the public square. The father of the country and the author of the Declaration of Independence, respectively, being exorcised from national history. The military is suffering from its lowest recruitment numbers since the end of the draft after the Vietnam War. The police struggle to hire enough officers. The criminal justice system is under assault from all sides. What began as calls for bail reform quickly escalated into defund the police, or said more poignantly on the streets of Minneapolis, we don't want no effing police. My guest today has rightly described this conflict as a battle for the soul of America, and he should know. Joe Gamaldi is a police officer. He is the vice president of the National Fraternal Order of Police and can give us an insight on what is happening to American law enforcement and the criminal justice system in the current environment. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Shane. How are you?
I'm doing well. Before we get into this full, get off my lawn mode, because I'm not quite as pessimistic as I sound. Tell us a little bit of your backstory. How did you get into law enforcement? How did you end up as the voice for the largest police union in the country?
Well, I actually started my law enforcement career about 19 years ago now in the NYPD. Graduated college. I wanted to get involved in a profession where I could help people. I know it sounds so generic when we say it as police officers, but that's really what most of us get into this too. We wanted to help people. So I became a police officer there. I worked there for 3 years. And, I was living in a shoebox apartment, the type that's so small when you open your bedroom door, it hits your bed. And I was like, this is not really what I want for my life. So I transferred down to the Houston Police Department about 16 years ago. Kind of the rest is history. I got involved with the local union there thanks to an exceptional mentor. I climbed the ranks there, became the president of the Houston Police Officers Union. And then I just had this opportunity. I wasn't really looking for it. Some people approached me and said, hey, we think you'd be a real good fit to be the national vice president. We think you should run. I had to think it over for a little bit, but finally I decided to jump in. And anybody who knows me, when I put my mind to something, there ain't no stopping me. So, and then it just grew from there, and started doing news interviews left and right. And it's been an exceptional ride, but I take it as an honor to really voice the concerns of police officers. And all I'm trying to do is tell the public how officers feel, the ones that are sitting in the car patrolling every night, and I still work night shift, how we feel about our profession, how we feel about the way a segment of the public treats us, how we feel about the direction of the country. And it's my job to vocalize those concerns and make sure that the public understands just how bad things are. Because I don't think people are busy. They have lives. They got to take their kids to soccer practice, to swim practice, whatever. And maybe they don't know that in the last 2 years in the United States, we've had over 20,000 homicides in this country. We haven't seen those numbers since the mid-1990s. It is an exceptionally more violent country than we're accustomed to living to over the last few years. And a lot of people always ask me, well, Joe, why is that? And the answer is simple. There's been a toxic cocktail that have been shoved down the throats of Americans in this country. And that cocktail is rogue DAs who keep letting people out over and over again with sweetheart deals. It's activist judges who damn near just want to see criminals run wild, and bail reform. Because everywhere bail reform has been tried, it has been an unmitigated disaster. And it has led to worse outcomes. And when I talk about bail reform, everyone just says, oh, well, that's just cops complaining because the guys get right back out. And they do. Don't get me wrong. We have criminals, hardened criminals, who are committing aggravated robberies, who are getting out on bail, PR bonds where they just pinky promise to show up to court. They're getting out before we're done with the paperwork. But it's not just us being impacted. It's the community that's being impacted in the increase in violence. And we can go into more all the other impacts on the community. But you know who else it's not helping? The suspect itself. You know why? Because they're never learning their lesson. If we caught that 18, 19-year-old that does an ag robbery and they do get a firm punishment, guess what? Maybe they actually won't do it again. But if they do it repeatedly and they get a PR bond, and no exaggeration, we have seen people with 8 aggravated robbery bonds on the streets in Houston. Do you think that person's learning their lesson? Do you think they're suddenly going to turn their life around and say, oh man, I really got to get straight this time? No, because there's no penalty for what they're doing.
Well, let's get into bail reform a little bit, and I think you're in a great position to talk about this too. But my personal thought on bail reform, and I think this was kind of borne out after George Floyd, was I think that bail reform is just one battle in a larger war against the criminal justice system. I mean, it started off as bail reform and because they looked at that as low-hanging fruit. But the instant that they thought they could make a move on the police, they did it. And no, we forgot all about bail reform until the attacks on the police became negative, and we backed off the bail reform. But you work in the Houston area. And so the Houston Police Department, Harris County, has a great deal of direct experience with bail reform, generally because of the O'Donnell case and the acquiescence of a new slate of judges who decided to just give up on challenging the O'Donnell case. Virtually all misdemeanor cases are released without having to pay any sort of meaningful bail. And you might sit there and go, it's just misdemeanors. But what is this? I mean, and let me take 2 steps back here because my son lives right outside Houston as well. He lives in Baytown. His wife works in Houston. He works in Beaumont. So they're in that area as well. So I hear stories from him also. But what has this done to Houston and Harris County? Is it just misdemeanors are all good, or is there spillover?
Oh, it's complete spillover. So first of all, there's like an 80% rate of not showing up to court on these PR bonds. It's ridiculous. Nobody comes to court anymore. And there is no such thing as like charging them with bail jumping anymore where they just don't show. They don't even do it. So they're running wild. And what happened was, and you'll hear this from critics too, when I criticize the huge increase in murders, because we saw a huge spike in murders in Houston over the last 2 years prior. A bad year for us was like 250, 275 murders. And then we surged to like well over 400 for several years straight, right about the time that we saw this spread into the felony courts. And the critics will say, well, you only have misdemeanor bail reform. It's not really the felony courts. Anybody who does any kind of research or looks at it, the felony judges got right in line with the misdemeanor judges and started giving PR bonds left and right for violent crime. I mean, we have people that are out on multiple capital murder bonds. It is completely insane. And the interesting part is if you look at where bail reform is tried, you will see what I like to refer to as like almost a cottage industry develop around it, where we have all these bureaucratic positions. Their whole job is to sell people that bail reform is working. And they will manipulate the statistics to try to make it work until an outside entity comes and looks at it. And we've seen this play out in Harris County, where they were saying this was a big success. And the bail bondsmen in Harris County said, wait a minute, they did their own independent study. 80% of people ain't showing to court. Same thing happened in Chicago. Chicago started releasing out all these statistics about how this is a big success. Then the University of Utah came in and looked at it and said, hold on, people are reoffending that are out on, out on bail reform. They're reoffending at a violent crime rate of 50%. They saw the same results in California. So I will tell people, if you're kind of, middle of the road on bail reform, and, it's interesting enough, I was sitting down with a young couple that live out in Boise, Idaho the other day for dinner. And they said, hey, Joe, you're up on this stuff. I mean, what's the deal with bail reform? Like, what is it? I kind of feel like, it's a good thing. People shouldn't just be held for no reason. And it's just kind of the talking points that you hear. And when I sat down and explained to them, there were issues with bail prior to this, okay? The single mother who was driving with a suspended license shouldn't have been held on a $10,000 bond, okay? We should have been doing PR bonds back then. But we should have taken a scalpel to this problem and addressed those root issues. Instead, we took a sledgehammer and we started letting everyone and anyone out. And do you think it's any coincidence that about the time this bail reform and defund the police and everything else we've been talking about, it said this is going to help our communities? Well, guess what? And specifically, this is going to help our minority communities. I've heard this over and over again, right? the homicide rate for Black men has risen to 12 times the homicide rate of anybody else in this country. So is bail reform helping Black men? Is defund the police helping Black men? And I'll do you one better. The very communities that we're trying to protect are seeing stores closing in their area. Target is closing. CVS, Walgreens, we see this in Seattle, Portland, Chicago. In Chicago, the CEO of McDonald's says he doesn't feel comfortable letting people come to work because it's so dangerous. And what that does is it creates food deserts and financial deserts for the people living within their community. There's less economic opportunity. There's less jobs. Less jobs means more crime, and more crime means a less quality of life for them. So who is it really helping? And the truth is that the people that are pushing bail reform, the far left, the woke, however you want to refer to them, they don't give a damn about the people living in these communities. They care about their ideology only. And the, massive deaths we are seeing in the Black community, the lack of opportunities that we're seeing in our lower income communities, they don't care about them. They just care about pushing their radical ideology.
Well, I think, and this probably gets into some stuff I was going to bring up later, but I think it illustrates an underlying racism in the liberal side of the aisle, in that a lot of people make this argument that don't really have any experience with the minority community. And so they view all minorities as criminals. And so they just look at this and go, well, anything that helps someone who's charged with a crime by default helps the minority community. They don't really realize that, yes, there's a larger percentage of the minority community that engages in crime, but there's a much, much larger percentage of that community that are the victims of those criminals. And so going easier on those criminals is not helping those communities, but they don't really see it that way.
Well, of course not. And a lot of these people that are pushing it are people that, live in gated communities, or they live in a building with a doorman. And, they're not shopping at Target. They're shopping at Whole Foods. They're not shopping at the corner store where they might get robbed walking in there. They may DoorDash their food. So they're not worried about these types of things. But you know who sees the real life impact every single day? Us, police officers. Because we are interacting with the good people in those communities. We are interacting with the victims. And then when I talk about these statistics of 20,000 homicides and all of this crime, I think it gets lost on people that these are real people. These are fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, families ripped apart forever because we wanted to chase this radical idea that no one should be held accountable for their actions. And you mentioned it before. I really do believe we are fighting for the very soul of our country right now. And there's a fork in the road. And down one fork is chaos and disorder. And we know where that leads.
Right.
Well, we can take the law and order route and we can take our streets back. And the most important thing is it's within our capacity to change because we know what works. The American police officer delivered historic crime reductions prior to this crime spike that basically started in 2019, before the pandemic, by the way. People don't even like to talk about that because they like to blame it all on the pandemic.
Sure.
But crime started to rise well before that. We were able to provide these huge reductions in crime, which led to an urban renaissance, which led to people having successful careers and opportunities within our urban communities because we embraced broken windows theories, because we actually held people accountable, and we threw the book at dirtbags who were out there robbing people, shooting people. And here's another thing, Shane. We like to have a conversation in this country about guns, right? And I'm not going to get into if you're on, do you want to take guns away? You want to have more guns? Whatever. I think we can all agree, though, that if someone commits a crime with a gun, we should take that very, very seriously, right? Both sides of the aisle should agree on that. But yet we have people who are on the far left saying we should let somebody out on a bond who used a gun in a crime. We should let someone off with a sweetheart deal probation after they've shot someone. I mean, are you kidding me? If you commit a crime with a gun, an aggravated robbery, you should be looking at no bond. You should be looking at a 20-year sentence. And I guarantee that'll get these criminals' attention real fast.
Well, that has been the technique that's been used. Like I'm in the Kansas City area. So one of the things that trying to cut down on gun violence and just violence in general in Kansas City was the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department coupled with the federal system, because the penalties for firearms possession were much worse in the federal system. So they would arrest people for simple possession of firearms. I mean, not simple, but basically felon in possession of firearms. You were in possession of firearms with a drug. And then they would charge those people at the federal level And they were serving 3 and 4 years plus another 2 or 3 years of supervised release after that, whereas they would have at the most been put on probation at the local level. So
yeah, no, you're exactly right. And the federal partners can certainly be helpful, if they have the right resources and they're, being able to help us out with a lot of cases. And that can be a good tool. But if we don't utilize that and we don't have a DA's office that are willing to help us out with these cases that just want to get them off their docket, then that won't be successful. And
well,
I think go ahead.
That can change based on the administration that's in too. That emphasis will change depending on what the people at the top are like. Oh, hey, we need to focus on this because it's politically expedient for us to do so, or not focus on it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that people understand. I think too often the public they get concerned very much with their national elections, right? Their congressman, their senator, their president. Everybody's focusing on that. Where the biggest impact is going to be on you and your family are in local elections. Your city council races, your mayors, your county executives, your school board, your DA, your judges, if they're elected.
Right.
Though that's where you really see the differences in your community. So I implore people that are listening to this right now. I know you are busy. I know you have a lot going on in your life, and you're probably saying, Joe, I don't have time to research all these candidates, but it makes a difference. If you really look at these district attorney races, you can see an entire community change simply based upon a district attorney because they have such wide latitude with no oversight. I will remind you, DAs and judges have like absolutely no oversight. We got body cameras on every day, which I don't mind. But why doesn't a DA have a body camera on when they're negotiating a police settlement for somebody who shot 2 people? So I just tell people, make sure you're doing research on your candidates. Make sure you're picking people that are on a bedrock foundation of law and order, because that is the basis of your community. Businesses can't thrive. Schools can't do well. Kids can't develop. All of these things start with public safety. So if you have somebody in your community that is not standing on a bedrock platform of public and safety, you need to vote their ass out.
Well, and you need to make sure that they really do believe that, because they'll all say that.
Yeah.
I'm releasing these people because we're going to bring more equity into the criminal justice system and more fairness in the criminal justice system. But what that really means, the translation of that is, I'm letting these people go and I'm not going to charge them for these offenses.
Yeah, and I hate to go all tinfoil hat on everybody, but if a DA is being given money by George Soros or any of his groups, don't vote for them. I assure you, no matter what is coming out of their mouth, they are going to take that DA's office very far left. They're going to be letting people out left and right. They're going to be cutting sweetheart deals. They are not going to throw the book at anyone within your community. So just, FYI. And another thing too that I wanted to touch on was, I don't think the general public understands the role of a bail bondsman. And I try to tell people, because they'll be, bail bondsmen are evil. They're just trying to get money, blah, blah, blah. I go, do you understand that they play an integral part in making sure that people show up to court? They are making sure that these violent people who may have paid an exorbitant bond to get out are making sure that they're showing up to their court dates. They're checking in with mom, who may have put their house up, or grandma, or whoever, to make sure that this individual is going to be there. Because what I often hear from people is, well, bail isn't really fair to poor people because they don't have money, and anybody who's rich can get out. Well, hold on. Because if we had judges who actually cared and spent the time to look at cases, because this is what it really should be, is a judge should be looking at, what are the means of this person? What is the risk that they pose to the community? How likely are they to reoffend? How likely are they to show up to court? All of those things should be looked at. And the argument from the judges is, well, we don't have time to do that. Well, I guess you don't have time if you only want to work 3 hours a day and you want to go play golf and you want to be off on the weekends. You don't want to do this. They're lazy. That's really what it boils down to. So instead, it's much easier to just rubber stamp everything. And I don't know how they sleep at night. I mean, it almost borders on the lack of empathy and caring that they have for the community is unlike anything I've ever seen. Because you'll see a judge who lets someone out on a low bond, PR bond, whatever, for a violent crime. That person goes and murders someone. And I don't know about you, Shane, but that would weigh on my conscience heavily. And you could understand if they make the mistake once, right?
Right.
I let this person out. I thought they were going to show up to court. I didn't think they were going to be a risk. But then you see these judges that do it over and over and over again. And you start to realize like they really do not care about the downstream harm of their decisions whatsoever. They must sleep like a baby. I mean, it almost borders on them being a sociopath, because I can't imagine how you could continue to do this and not feel crushing guilt at the downstream, impact of what's happening.
I mean, not to defend the judge or anything, but it's a question of becoming inured to it. I mean, they only see criminal defendants, generally don't see the victims for the most part. And so unless you go for a trial, and trials only represent maybe 1 or 2% of case resolutions. And so all you're seeing is the defendant come in with his attorney, and he's dressed in a suit, and he's, being put on his best possible face. Unless you're seeing that body camera footage at a trial or anything like that. And his attorney is basically trying to, we don't want to see that because that looks really bad.
Yeah.
That's
not going to look good for my client.
Exactly. So we're not going to show that. So, I mean, it's just, when we talk to people, you still have to back up and say, okay, wait a second, this person that we're talking to, this is a bad situation for them. It may be a misdemeanor domestic violence case that we see 15 of them a day. And so it doesn't have quite the same impact, but it has all kinds of impact on that person that's sitting across the table from you. And it can be easy over time to become hardened to those situations. I mean, I don't want to defend the judge on that, because I watched a judge today, and I'll just get an anecdotal story. I had court earlier this morning. I had to appear at a hearing. So I'm watching him, and this girl's in custody. She'd been there for 3 weeks. And the attorney's making the argument that, well, she's charged with possession of methamphetamine, possession of a firearm by a felon, possession of a defaced firearm, meaning they tried to remove the serial numbers, and misdemeanor theft. Basically, she was shoplifting with her friend, and when they arrested him, she had the stolen gun, and she's a convicted felon, and she had the methamphetamine on her person. And so they were making a motion for a signature bond, and the attorney's making the motion that she's on probation someplace else, and she'd sure like to get back into compliance. And it's like, these really seem like arguments to me for not changing the bond, not arguments.
She really wants to get back in compliance.
Exactly.
While she's shoplifting with a gun and drugs.
And the Diaz, I was like, well, yeah, she looks like she's presumptive probation, even if we convict her. So we're opposed. And the judge is like, wags his finger. Well, this is your one PR bond. I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, I could see maybe on just the simple possession or the shoplifting, but the gun with the defaced serial numbers on it, that's something bad waiting to happen. When the security guard tries to grab you in the store and you've got a gun in your purse.
Exactly.
That I just did surprise. And this judge is generally a pretty good law and order guy, but the prosecutor didn't oppose it. So what's he supposed to do?
Yeah. And now what have we taught that suspect?
Sure.
Yeah, we've taught her, you can continue to do this. We're not going to take it seriously. I mean, and listen, folks, this isn't rocket science. If there is no consequences for deviant behavior, the deviant behavior is going to continue. We've known this since the beginning of time. There needs to be consequences or it won't stop. And you touched on shoplifting. I don't think anybody realizes last year, retail theft topped $100 billion with a B dollars. $100 billion. And this is one of my favorite arguments when you hear people say, well, I mean, don't worry about that. That's just a victimless crime. I'm like, oh my God, it blows my mind because there is a victim in here. And you know who the victim is? Everybody. All of us. Because these companies don't just take those losses. Those insurance companies don't just pay that. They up the premiums on these companies. And then these companies, guess who they pass the cost on? You. So everybody who shops at Target or CVS or Walgreens, like a grocery store, everything else, everybody's seen the prices go up because of inflation. That's also because everything's getting stolen that ain't nailed down. And they pass those costs on to you. So when you see that dirt bag with a trash bag full of stuff, just loading things in, that cost is being passed on to you. And then, of course, you mentioned there are plenty of times where that simple shoplifting that everybody doesn't want to get worked up about, turns into an aggravated robbery because a security guard tries to stop, or an officer gets involved and tries to stop him.
Right.
It turns into a struggle. These type of things happen every single day. And I mean, they've basically made it very clear in these cities that it's open season. You can steal as much as you want. I mean, there is a small segment of the population in New York. There's about 450 people that roughly account for like 70% of the retail thefts they're seeing. And if we just threw them in jail, you could see a huge reduction in crime as a result of it. They did a report about it at their ComStat and NYPD. Or just another recent success that they had in San Francisco. They finally decided that they had enough of getting cars broken into. So they went to the police officer and said, we want you to be proactive. We want you to do surveillance. We want you to arrest them. And the DA's office is actually going to back you up and file motions for them to have to stay in jail while they're awaiting a court date and make sure they threw the book at them. They did this program for a few months. They saw over a 50% reduction in break-ins in cars in that area. It's not a shock. We know what works. We have to throw the book at them. We have to make sure they stay in jail, and we have to make sure there are penalties.
Well, and that sort of raises another question that I sort of have here is one of the arguments that bail reformers claim is that people are languishing in jail because they can't afford to postpone. But then they follow up that argument with the argument that most people get out anyway, which those are seemingly conflicting arguments. Either they're sitting in jail indefinitely or they're getting out anyway. Yeah. But despite this conflict between these, it is true that most people are able to secure some sort of pretrial release. Even in a bail heavy place, they still are usually able to post bail. So, I mean, about 75 to 80% of people are able to manage to get out on a pretrial basis. They're not necessarily held for the duration of their charge. So the question I ask from a lot of people, a lot of guests I have on here is why does financial bail release work? Because it does work, both to secure a reduction in failures to appear and a reduction in overall crime, while other forms of pretrial release have basically seemingly the opposite effect. It's the same people getting out, and wouldn't you expect the same behavior regardless of release type? But how is it that bail works different, or financial bail works different?
In my opinion, there has to be skin in the game. And, when we see a lot of these suspects who may be, as I talked about, something serious, and they do have a high bond when they finally get one, as I talked about earlier, it may be grandma's house that's on the line. Grandma, family is going to make sure that person shows up to court. Or if dad and mom put up $30,000, they're going to make sure that person shows up. There's skin in the game to make sure that this individual shows up to court. Because right now, the way they do, and they stopped prosecuting bail jumping, essentially. Now they won't say that, but they have stopped, okay?
Right.
So there's no consequence. So it used to be you lost money and you got thrown in jail. Well, now you don't lose any money and you don't get thrown in jail. So what's the point? I don't have to worry about showing up to court. Cut off your ankle monitor. Who cares? They don't even charge them for that. They'll just say, no big deal. We'll slap another one on next time. So we have created an entire culture of lawlessness in our country. And if there's no accountability and there's no mechanisms in place to make sure that person is, brought to court, then they never see the consequences of their actions. And not only that, we talked about it earlier, the victim doesn't get their justice, because there's a victim in all of this who every time a trial date is pushed back because this person didn't show up, every time. I mean, we have cases that are getting scheduled for years from now for a jury trial.
Sure.
Is that fair to these victims as well? Everyone wants to talk about the fairness of the suspect. Why doesn't anybody give a damn about the victim? Why are DAs cutting these deals without consulting with the victims? Why are judges making sure that these people can be back out without any thought to the victims? And I don't know why we are not more victim-centric in a criminal justice society. Instead, we are suspect-centric. We focus on them, what's best for them, how can it work for them, instead of victims. And we just have it completely backwards.
Well, the United States has always had, to a certain extent, an anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, mindset, from the revolution forward. And so they don't like to necessarily give up, that degree of power to the government to make those sorts of decisions. But ultimately, if you let the pendulum swing too far one way, it's going to swing back the other way, and it'll be that much harsher. I mean, we won't have that balance. You mentioned earlier about Illinois and the Safety Act, and I did a podcast on just a little brief talk about that. But I think that from a bail perspective, the Safety Act and the Illinois experience is a cancer that threatens to sweep across the country. Before it even took effect, I was at public forums talking about bail issues, and we had bail reform advocates claiming that they've already done away with bail in Illinois and it hadn't had any impact whatsoever. It's like that hasn't even taken effect yet. That was a year ago when they're just first, talking about it. And the concern is the politicians will lie about the consequences of letting criminals go because they made those decisions, they passed those laws and let them go. And I can't be in a position of saying, oh, look, my actions caused this increase in crime. And so the statistics get manipulated. You mentioned that earlier about statistics being changed and the lack of filing charges for what we in Kansas call aggravated failure to appear, but that's the bail jumping statute. Mm-hmm. I was at a legislative argument over bail releases, and there was a judge there who was trying to base his failure to appear rate based on the number of aggravated failure to appear charges that were filed. Well, that's a purely discretionary metric. It's like if you made that measure, I didn't have anybody that jumped bond on me the entire year because none of them got charged with that. Even though I still had to go get them back in or pay the forfeiture, they didn't actually charge them with the crime. So, I mean, and the state of New Jersey has changed up how they define failure to appear or how they calculate it all. It used to be you'd have, well, if you posted bond and you missed court at any point during the trial or the court process, that was one bond, one failure to appear. Now they've done and calculated, said, okay, well, you posted bond here and you had 10 court appearances. You made 9 of them and you missed the 10th one. That's a 90% appearance rate. Like, no, that's a 100% failure to appear rate. But it's just, so I guess the question is, what are you hearing from FOP members in Illinois about how this is? It's only been in effect for about 3 months, but what's the downside or what's going on in Illinois?
Yeah, so real quick, I do want to touch on, manipulating the numbers. For a while here in Harris County, what they were doing on the misdemeanor stuff is when someone wouldn't show up to court, they wouldn't count it as a failure to appear. They just reschedule them. Even though they weren't there, they would just reschedule them for another date. And then it doesn't look like the person didn't show up to court. So that's just a little anecdote. But no, I mean, from what I'm hearing from people in Illinois, they were fighting this tooth and nail from the get-go because they knew it was going to be a disaster. And that's exactly what it's been. And, when this act was about to be passed, we were digging in the numbers in Illinois, and the murder rate had increased, or they'd seen an increase in murders by about 48% over the last 10 years. So let me just ask like a simple question, and to bear this down to the minimum is, if you know that crime and murders are up in your state, why would anyone in their right mind pass any kind of legislation that would make it easier for criminals? I mean, it's as logical as it gets. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier that they don't care. These politicians do not care about the people in these communities, because if they did, they would never pass these laws. They don't give a damn about them. And it's beyond frustrating that we've gotten to this point. And what I like to tell people is it all boils down to money as well. There is a push on the far left and on the left to make sure there are as little people in jail as possible, because the less people in jail, the less money it's going to cost taxpayers. But what they don't discuss is the collateral damage that causes, because those criminals then aren't in jail. They're on the streets committing crimes. So they want to use this extra money that they're going to get from people not being in jail to increase social programs and make sure that people are, once again, married to the government for something that they may need, which in turn sets up a generation of voters that will be loyal to the people that gave them these things. A tale as old as time, right? But what
the LBJ tactic.
What's that?
The LBJ tactic.
Yeah. But the truth is, what they will never discuss and what's off to the side and behind the curtain is, there's going to be chaos and disorder in your community. People are going to get murdered. Businesses are going to close. You're going to have less opportunities. You're not going to be able to get that job you wanted to get because the business that you're going to work for closed. And it just erases any possible future that someone could have in those communities. Oh, your schools are going to be terrible because these the people that we like to refer to as kids, even though they're 18 years old, are still going to be committing crimes in schools. And it just creates almost a doom cycle in that community that people can't get out of. And they'll never discuss that. And they'll never discuss how they've ruined our urban communities for a generation in search of this, radical ideology. It's so frustrating from our point of view because we work really hard to protect our communities and we give our lives. We just released the numbers for officers shot in 2023. We had 378 police officers shot in this country. That is a 60% increase since 2018. We had 115 ambush attacks on police officers, resulting in 138 officers shot, and 46 officers gave their lives as a result of being shot. Those are just officers shot numbers. It's abhorrent. It's horrifying the amount of violence that has been committed on law enforcement over the last few years. There is an absolute war on cops in this country. We are here to protect our communities. We're giving our lives to do it. And yet we have an entire political ideology that's willing to give those communities right over to criminals and continue to see officers shot. It's disgusting.
Well, I kind of had this flagged in here question-wise is sort of the elephant in the room, and that's sort of the element of race. Heather McDonald, in a couple of her books, has said that, and I'm paraphrasing her here, so it's not an exact quote, so don't fire me from Harvard.
Yeah.
That we as a society wouldn't give a damn about pretrial release, mass incarceration, policings, or prisons, or how law enforcement worked at all, if there wasn't a disparity in the races of people involved in the criminal justice system. And of course, the popular argument is that this disparity exists because everything is racist. And the focus of Heather McDonald's books has been trying to push back on that with specific data and facts, like the black murder rate, that racial components for arrests of violent crimes line up perfectly with the races of the purported perpetrators. It's not like, some white guy just beat you up, and so we're going to go arrest the black guy for doing that. You were identified as this way. And those racial arrests, or the arrest by race, line up perfectly with the races by crimes committed. Now, it seems to make sense because you wouldn't want to go, as a police officer, go out and try and arrest someone of a completely different race. But so this sort of kind of a long preamble to that. But so from your perspective, and you have much more direct experience with this than most anybody, is the criminal justice system, racist to its core? And if not, how do those of us involved counter this so-called common knowledge that's out there? Because, everybody knows that everybody's racist, and that's the only reason police are doing this.
Yeah, no one ever likes this answer, but it is the truth, and, it is what it is. We go where the crime is. So wherever the crime is happening is where police officers are going. So if it happens to be in a predominantly black neighborhood or a predominantly white neighborhood, whatever, those are the people that are going to end up getting arrested.
Right.
And I'll give you a great example. University of Maryland, University of Michigan did a joint study on police shootings, right? They found no racial motivation in shootings. None for police shootings.
Right.
But you know what they did find? Wherever there is the most violence is where there will be the most police shootings, which makes sense, obviously. If there's
Right.
So whatever the predominant race of that area is where there will be the most police shootings, obviously, of that race. So it just boils down to complete logic that no one likes to consider anymore nowadays. Where there's violence, there will be police shootings. Where there's police shootings and violence, whatever the predominant race is of that area will be the ones that end up getting shot by police officers. It's just that simple. And what I tell people, and as I said, we go where the crime is. We're not going to communities that, people, and not only that, people want us in their communities. Everything gets lost in the defund the police. That's a radical element. Most of the people that I deal with on a daily basis, not only are they happy that we are in communities, they want us there more. Can you please patrol more? We would like more of you in there, because they don't want that criminal element in their community either, because it impacts them directly.
Well, even the arguments that they make against the police are arguments grounded in, why weren't you here yesterday when my car was broken into? Not, but now you're arresting my kid for breaking this other car. Well, how come you weren't here before? It's, why weren't you here more? Not, why are you doing this now? Even if you're mad it's because there wasn't enough police present, not that there was too much.
You're exactly right. And it just, again, it's why I talk about making sure you're voting for the right people, because, this, as you said, bail reform is but a small part of really trying to erase the legitimacy of crime, of law and order, and trying to control our society, make sure that everybody has a chance to thrive. I mean, you vote for people. I mean, there's people right now in state legislatures that are trying to get us to not be able to do traffic stops and just say,
I'm aware.
Yeah, you shouldn't be allowed to do traffic stops. Well, you know what? Okay, fine. If that's what you want, then tell us you don't want us to do traffic stops anymore, and we'll stop completely. But don't come crying to us when the consequences come into play, because the Kansas City gun experiment showed us that 1 in every 28 traffic stops yields an illegal gun off the street. In 2020, 42% of the guns taken off the street in New York, traffic stops. So if you don't want us to do traffic stops anymore, then just tell us. We won't do them, but then don't cry about the consequences down the road.
Or just the lost tax revenue from your vehicle registration. I mean, there's a narrative that's going around. It hits from city to city where they take an area that's about 60% black and maybe 40% other races. And so then they'll look at the stops and they'll go, well, look, more black people are being stopped in this area. So that's just proof that the police are racist in those areas and cycling them out. But when you break it down and look into it, the bulk of people of color that are being stopped for expired tags, whereas the bulk of people who are white are being stopped for speeding, both of which are legitimate stops. But one is a whole lot easier to stop you for, especially if you have a tag scanner or anything like that. It's easy to see that, hey, that temporary tag you have that's fake, that's long since expired, or it just lights up on your car that this tag's expired. Well, I'm going to pull this person over, whether it's pretextual or not. That's the way community policing works. If your tags are expired, there might be something else going on there.
Yeah, so, and you'll listen to these politicians. They've all got the solutions. I think it was Thomas Sowell said that there's no solution, only trade-offs. And and the trade-offs are, hey, you're going to be living in a much dangerous community. Some of your family members are probably going to get killed. But hey, we really won this one. We're not going to do traffic stops anymore, and we're going to let suspects out. Like, how do we even marry those things and say, yeah, that's a trade-off we really want?
I did read a study, and this kind of goes back to your point of the doom cycle, and kind of brings in race as well, that basically adjusted crime rates. And then the adjustment point that they made on that was single family households, single parent households, basically households without fathers was what it came down to be. And when you looked at the crime rate, when you focused on just that, the racial disparity in crime disappeared. So the crime rate was the same, essentially, regardless of your race, if you were in a fatherless household. Now, the problem then is who has a larger percentage of fatherless households? And how do we as a society get back into traditional families? Because the traditional family is one of the things that helps cut down on the crime rate. You have two parents that are both supervising that person.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been widely studied that two-parent households, there are always going to be better outcomes for the children that are involved. What we need to look at is, why is it that the same cities, the same blocks, the same neighborhoods are constantly, for the last 50, 60, 70 years, riddled by crime? Why is it the same communities don't have these opportunities? Why is it the same over and over and over again? So we have to get to the root cause. And obviously, a one-parent household is one of those root causes. It's better opportunities in their schools. It's more job opportunities in their communities. It's businesses moving in. It's making sure that we have people that want to live in that area, that business want to operate, so that the tax revenue stays high. All of these things play a role. Now, we've seen the absolute erosion of tax bases in places like Seattle, Portland,
Sure.
Cities in California. I mean, you can't even find a U-Haul truck because so many people are moving out of there. New York. So as that tax base gets completely eroded because businesses and people move out, that's less opportunities for those communities. And I've talked about this. All of it starts, though, at public safety. We need to make sure that we have safe communities. Otherwise, none of these other things happen. So if we don't have that baseline, we're not going to get thriving businesses. We're not going to get thriving schools. And there needs to be a push nationally to talk about two-parent households, the responsibility that you have to your children, the better outcome for, I think it's almost like it's celebrated, like, oh, we're raising this kid in a one-parent household. Like, just have a conversation about how it is better outcomes for those kids. And that's one of the ways we can start to turn things around, but also making sure that there is a safe community for them to thrive in.
Okay, so let's take a step back from the end of the world, and we'll get to go back to that here in just a second here. Just talking about bail bondsmen, over the years, I've noticed what I would call kind of an underlying attitude of contempt for bail bondsmen from law enforcement, particularly older law enforcement. Despite the fact that I certainly feel that we're on the same side of this, criminal justice coin. Often they have bondsmen that they personally like that were in their area and they've known since they were patrol officers, and now they're, the undersheriff or whatever. Kind of like Congress. People like their congressman, but don't really care for Congress as a whole. Now, do you think that attitude is changing at all inside law enforcement when they're now seeing the alternative of not having bail bondsmen around?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak from my own personal experience. I've always had a great relationship with bail bondsmen in the Houston area. Always found them to be caring about their community, always found them to be caring about public safety in general. Like, of course, they're running a business too. I'm not naive to that. Sure. But I think probably the perception has changed quite a bit. I think a lot of police officers, because of bail reform just recently, have noticed the value the bail bondsmen provide to the community. I think they understand now, where maybe they didn't in the past, that like, yeah, you guys are a business and you have to make money. But at the same time, you were making sure people's asses were showing up to court. You were making sure that people who got out were having their day in court and that victims were getting justice. And I don't think that people thought of y'all that way until recently. I think they really just thought of bail bondsmen as, hey, y'all are just trying to make a buck or whatever. But I think everybody realizes your value now. And as I've said, I've had a great relationship with bail bondsmen. Not only that, when the fight for bail reform started, we were always on the same side and working together to try to make people understand just how dangerous this was going to be. I mean, we were literally the canary in the coal mine. You know what I mean? We were trying to sound the alarm to people. And unfortunately, a lot of people did not listen. And now we're living in the ashes of those decisions.
Well, and I think there's a symbiotic relationship there. One of the things I've talked about in the past is, we're, like I said, I'm in Kansas City and I'm on the Kansas side. And so we do have a state line, sort of in the way. And so a lot of my clients, I'm just on the Kansas side. A lot of my clients, although, are from Missouri. And what I noticed after Ferguson, and this is going back to the Ferguson Effect argument, where the police, were accused of a situation around Mike Brown, but there seemed to be a pullback from proactive policing. And we could tell, just basically, one of the benefits we have, and this is, not necessarily proud of this, but if someone misses court, there's a pretty good chance they might get caught by the police before we get a chance to catch them, or vice versa. I mean, it works both ways. But we could certainly see, following the Ferguson riots and then the Michael Brown death, that we had to go pick up more people, just because, and we were not getting the same degree of support from the Kansas City Police Department that we were before, that they were not being as proactive at pulling people over. I mean, there was a policy decision from the top of the department. No, don't do this. We don't want to be accused of this. We don't want any riots here like they had in St. Louis. And so we're just going to back off of this. But then you saw crime increase because of that, because that proactive policing had backed off. And so, no, we found that we were having to be much more aggressive about going out and getting people picked up, even if one of our tactics has always been, hey, I know exactly where this person is. Yes, we can go get him, but it's across state lines. How about I call the police and go, this person's there, they just call me, or I'll have, the guarantor on the bond call me. He's here right now. Well, I'm not the police. I can't hop in a car and be there in a snap. You know who is 3 blocks down the road is that police department. And they may or may not come out on that. So, I mean, there has been a pullback, sadly, from, in at least in the Kansas, Missouri area that I've noticed, but some other areas as well, that they're just not as proactive about it as they were before, because nobody wants to be the police officer that's on the national news.
Oh, for sure. And it also plays a role with the leadership within law enforcement. There were a lot of chiefs that basically made it clear they wanted to pull back. They disbanded units that whole purpose was to do proactive policing. So
Right.
the message was sent clearly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah, no, I mean, the message was sent to police officers, and don't get me wrong, we go out there every single day, the brave men and women of law enforcement, and we're still doing proactive work, and there are still police officers that are going out there and trying to get these bad guys. But it's the reality is that it used to be that if you were following policy, training, and the law, that you would be backed up by your chief and by your elected officials. That's not the case anymore. You could be within policy, training, and the law, they'll still bury you. They're still, I mean, if any police officer thinks, or any member of the public thinks, man, if that officer just does it the right way, he's going to be fine. He or she's going to be fine. That's all bullshit now. Basically, it's if you screw up, not if you screw up, but if you do something and it makes national news to where we're getting pressure, we're probably going to fire you because it's just easier for us.
Right.
So that's the risk that a lot of police officers are taking. And that's also why you see, police officers have been treated like crap in this country for the better part of a decade. And that has all played a role in retirements being up 20% nationwide. Resignations are up 47%. We can't find anybody we can't recruit anybody to take these jobs because intrinsically they know if something bad happens, I'm not going to be backed up. So I'm just going to lose my job. So those people who are really interested in a life of service, they're voting with their feet and they're taking jobs elsewhere. There's only really two solutions for police departments. That is to reduce services to the community. By the way, that doesn't mean a reduction in taxes. That just means we're going to not send somebody out when your house gets burglarized, which is horrible because it's the worst day of your life that you've ever experienced. And when you call the police, they're going to say, go to this website and fill out an online form. Who's going to be okay with that? Or you're going to wait 12 hours for me to get there. And they talk about having a great relationship with the community. How pissed off are you going to be if it took me 12 hours to get? I don't care if I'm the most friendly police officer you ever met. You're going to be upset that it took me that long. Mm-hmm. So it further erodes the trust with the community. And the other option, which they're already doing now, lowering standards for hiring police officers. And if you don't think those chickens are going to come home to roost a few years from now, you're dreaming. So for all the talk about how they want the most professional police departments, and by the way, we are the most professional we've ever been, the most training, the highest educated that we've ever been. But now they want to reduce standards to get people through the door. And those are going to pay the consequences, which is only going to further erode the trust that we're trying to build with the community.
Sure, it's the Clockwork Orange effect, where all of Alex's buddies end up in the police department, at the end of the day. But I mean, there has to be something. I mean, you have to have some degree of control over your society. You can't, just let it descend into anarchy. I mean, it is the central function of government is to provide some degree of order. Yep. And that has to come through, law enforcement.
Yeah, and I know I've been a lot of doom and gloom, but listen, there is a path forward, and I am an eternal optimist. And I don't just talk about problems; I talk about solutions. And I think where the solutions lie right now for the problems that we're facing in our communities is, number one, we need leadership at the top to condemn the violence against law enforcement because it's an absolute stain on our society. And anybody who is willing to allow a war on society's protectors is basically allowing their country to descend into chaos. So Joe Biden needs to step up and condemn the violence against law enforcement. But it's not just him. House Republicans need to pass the Protect and Serve Act, which would make it a federal crime to knowingly assault a police officer. And then from there, we can work on bringing broken windows theories back to our urban communities to make sure that we're taking care of low-level crimes that don't turn into bigger issues and stopping those low-level crimes and maybe picking up people who have warrants who would have done that robbery in the future.
Sure.
We can make sure to aggressively prosecute all violent criminals. And I'm talking show them absolutely no quarter. We can get our violent crime problem under control by incarcerating the people that commit it. It has been proven over and over again. Anybody who tells you, oh, you can't incarcerate your way out of a violent crime problem, they're lying to you.
Yes, they
are lying. And finally, we can get back to a place in this country where we actually support law enforcement. And I'm not saying you need to support us no matter what we do. But what I just said earlier, if we're following policy, training, and the law, you're damn right I am asking you to support us. And if we're wrong, we're going to say we're wrong and we're going to get it right.
Well, that sounds like a recipe for saving the soul of the nation.
It can certainly get us on the right foot and get us back to a path of law and order. and maybe give everybody the American dream back too, so that we can all chase prosperity, not just certain ones of us in certain communities.
Well, Joe, we're bumping up against our hour. So, I mean, I know, in all honesty, we could talk for another 3 hours. I mean, this is right in my wheelhouse. I love listening to this sort of stuff, but we should probably close it off here. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. I really hope that, the positive vision that you've laid out there, we can get to that without having the overreaction. I mean, the Clockwork Orange overreaction, that we want to get professional people back in that want to serve. I mean, there's a host of impediments to that, but I think we can get there if we all pull together. Hopefully, we as a country can still all pull together at some point.
I agree,
thank
Shane.
you very
Thank
much.
you so much for having me on.
We want to thank our guest, Joe Gamaldi, Vice President of the National Fraternal Order of Police, for taking the time to talk with us today. Hopefully, we can save the soul of the nation together. And law enforcement and bail are both part of that solution. We hope you'll join us next time for another episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.